So today I'd like to talk about the socialization process and role taking. We're going to spend some time in this unit talking about various theories or models of self. But before that, it's kind of useful to have a broad overview of the process of socialization and the impact that has on the emergence of and sort of the development of the self. Um, Broadly, before we dive into the details, I'd like to say a little bit um, um, to contextualize um, um, how we're going to understand the nature of the self as a kind of social phenomenon. Most people tend to think of the self as a predominantly psychological, individual sort of phenomenon, and sociology and social psychology, broadly speaking, see the self as a consequence of the operation of social processes and operating in an explicitly social environment, and that can be a little bit at odds with what people kind of bring to the class, which are the cultural assumptions that are kind of consistent with a psychological view of how these things operate and where these structures and phenomena come from. So I'm going to say a couple quick things about nature versus nurture, which is a kind of a nice framing mechanism for um, the understanding of the self as a kind of social product rather than something that arises out of our sort of organic makeup. Um, Probably most people these days, I hope anyway, most people these days recognize that a kind of nature versus nurture dichotomy is kind of a false construct. It's not really accurate, and most people, I think, recognize that it's an oversimplification. That in many ways, trying to separate nature and nurture um, isn't it's a non-starter, right? It's not something we can meaningfully do. And for those who are not familiar with the broad terms of the debate or conversation, when people say nurture, they mean social inputs. They mean environment, right? They mean the social and communal contexts in which people live. And when they talk about nature, they usually mean biology, and now in the 21st century, almost exclusively genetics. There are a number of different examples that show why this dichotomy is false, why this construct is not a particularly accurate one. I'm going to pick one just to make the point, but I think you could do this with lots of other examples. Let's talk about something called phenylketonuria. Phenylketonuria is a condition. It is specifically the body's inability to metabolize phenylalanine. Now, phenylalanine is an amino acid. It has implications for cognitive function and brain function. So we need to metabolize it. We need to get it out of our system, because if too much of it builds up in our brains, it threatens to create neurological and cognitive conditions that are really, really problematic. It's present in about 1 in 15,000 people, so it's not exceptionally common, but it's a thing. If you've ever picked up a can of diet soda and you read the little print on the side of the can, you'll see that it says phenylketonurics. There's like a warning for people who have phenylketonuria that the product contains phenylalanine, and people who have this condition should be careful about drinking too much of this product, because it's going to lead to a buildup, or it could lead to a buildup of phenylalanine in the system. So the cause of phenylalanine is a single mutated gene. right? So back in the late 20th century, scientists mapped the human genome, took that entire strand of DNA and they mapped it. And they discovered that people with this single mutated gene will have phenylketonuria. They have this inability to create an enzyme that will metabolize phenylalanine. In which case, you could make an argument that it is 100%, indisputably 100% biological, right? We know not only is it genetic, we know exactly which gene it is. Here's the thing, though. It only manifests in diets that feature phenylalanine, and not all foods contain this substance. So if you live in a part of the world and you consume a diet that doesn't have phenylalanine in any meaningful, presence in the foods that you consume, you will never experience the symptoms of phenylketonuria, even if you have this single defective gene, in which case somebody would say, well, then it's 100% environmental. But again, it's not 100% either. It's both of those things interacting. And that is kind of the thing that we want to keep in mind when we talk about, sort of the nature of human beings. We want to understand that we are a product of a very complicated interaction of environmental and organic conditions. That the human organism itself is born really early in the developmental process. When we are born, we can't walk, we can't recognize food, we can't avoid predation, we have no way to know how to protect ourselves from disease or from the elements or any of that stuff. If you took a newborn human infant out into the woods and you left it under a tree and you walked away, that infant is going to die, right? It is impossible for those organisms to survive independent of the social environments into which they are born. The thing that allows us to continue our development ex utero, right, outside of the womb, is that we are born into a kind of social womb. We are born into a social environment that will continue to nurture us and feed us and keep us warm and keep us free from disease and all of those other things until we have some degree of autonomy, right? And then we can begin to take care of ourselves. The culprit in all of this is our really, really large cranium, right? We need to be born relatively early in our developmental process because even early in our developmental process, we have these gigantic heads that contain these remarkable brains that allow us to do all kinds of amazing things. But those brains in those bodies will never reach a point where they can do amazing things unless they are taken care of until they become reasonably self-sufficient. So the trade-off in the sort of the evolutionary development of our species is that we're going to get born relatively early with very few innate capacities or skills that would allow us to survive because we need to get out of the birth canal. Right? While our brains are still small enough for us to pass out, our craniums are still small enough for us to pass out of our mother's wombs. But that only works, of course, if we're born into social environments. So if you ever have a conversation with somebody about nature versus nurture, and they're kind of scratching their heads and trying to get their minds wrapped around it, remind them that nurture is our nature. Right? That's how inextricably connected they are. That social environments and the rules that govern the behavior of people in those social environments, especially toward the young, are how we have adapted naturally to survive as a species. So again, it's not nature versus nurture, but rather nurture is our nature. And the thing that happens then to these newborn, incredibly vulnerable, less than fully developed human organisms is that they complete their developmental process through the inputs that come from socialization. So socialization is just the ongoing process of interaction, right? So actions between us and others through which we develop identities and acquire culture, right? So that's the nature of socialization. We are born into the world uh, tabula rasa, right? Kind of blank slates. This is one of the few places where sociology and psychology have almost perfect agreement, right? That human organisms at birth have relatively little in the way of abilities, but tremendous potentials. And as a result of social inputs and social interaction, we cultivate and build on those innate capacities to learn by actually learning. And we become social beings. We develop selves. We develop identities. Those are not things that we're born with, but they rather emerge in social contexts and as a result of social inputs. So in sociological social psychology, a couple of early theorists kind of took a look at what that looked like, right? Where does this socialization process um, where does it create, or through what set of actions does it end up creating this sense of identity, this sense of self? The first of these that I want to look at is a guy named Charles Cooley. Charles Cooley is probably the most well known for creating what we call the looking glass self, a theory of the looking glass self, which is this idea that the self, that sense of ourselves, is a reflection of the responses of others. We develop this sense of self through interactions in a series of stages. In the first stage of acquiring a looking glass self, and a looking glass just means mirror. It was a early 1900s term for mirror. But the idea that when we see other people and we watch them respond to us, we see something of us in how they're responding to us, right? Their responses to us tell us something about how they see us, which we then internalize and use to sort of see ourselves. So the looking glass self emerges, as I said, through a series of stages. In the first stage, we imagine how we appear to others, and I want to draw your attention to the word imagine, right? In the root of the word imagine is image, right? So picture, right? Reflection, if you will. So if I'm describing this process to my students and I look out into the classroom and I see people giving me that expression, I know that I need to stop and explain myself, because their reaction to me indicates some degree of confusion. And the source of that confusion is my inability to, or up until that moment, my inability to have adequately or clearly explained something. And so I know that I need to go back and do it again. So I am imagining how people see me based on how they're responding to me. I imagine the second stage, I imagine how they're evaluating what they see, right? So it's not just that you're looking at me funny. I'm going to attribute some meaning to those expressions or to that body language or to those reactions that tell me something about the judgments that you're making, the conclusions that you're drawing based on the things that I'm doing or saying. Your reaction to me is telling me something about myself, as I said. And then, of course, I develop a corresponding self-image and self-concept that is a reflection of that. So a really nice summation of Cooley's theory might be something on the order of, I am who I think you think I am, right? So that my sense of myself is a reflection of what I think you see when you look at me, right? So I am what I think you think I am. At the same time that Cooley is developing this model of a looking glass self, over at the University of Chicago, there's another sociologist, another social psychologist by the name of George Mead, who's developing a similar sort of way of thinking about the self. And for him, the key mechanism for all of this, the thing that makes all of this possible, is our capacity for what he calls reflexive behavior. Now, reflexive behavior is behavior in which the person initiating an action is the same as the person toward whom the action is directed. And this is something that loses students a lot. So I want you guys to be really, really careful and make sure you understand this. And if you feel like you have any doubts or any uncertainty about it, keep asking, keep talking about this until you get it down, because I know that from past experience, this is a thing that creates a lot of confusion for people. When we are talking about reflexive behavior, we are talking about one person's internal processes. Now, I'm going to illustrate it with an external demonstration. So, right, I am engaging in a behavior here, and that behavior is that I'm hitting myself. I'm the person doing the hitting, but I'm also the person being hit, right? So there's no other person involved here. It's just me doing something to me. Now, Mead's not talking about something we're doing externally. He's talking about something that's happening up here, right? So when Mead talks about reflexive behavior, the kind of action that he's thinking about is thought. So when you think about yourself, the thing that is doing the thinking is you. But the thing that you are thinking about is also you, right? So you are directing action toward yourself. In this case, the action being thought. So when you think about yourself, right, you again, you're the source of the action. You're also the recipient of that action, and I'll elaborate on this a little bit in the next video. But I want to make sure everyone understands that that's what we mean by reflexive behavior. Reflexive behavior isn't I do something to somebody else because they did that to me. It's not an interaction. It's an intra-action. It's internal. It's something that's happening inside of our minds. And one of the things that we and this ability to engage in reflexive behavior is innate. It's something we appear to be born with. Normal functioning brains. I'm not talking about brains with structural problems or developmental deficiencies, right? So normal operating human brains working the way that they are supposed to work seem to be hardwired with this capacity. So we say that this is a capacity or an innate ability that people are born with. One of the many things we learn to do with this, and we do a ton of stuff with reflexive behavior. It's a really, really amazing capacity that people have. But one of the things that we do with this capacity is we engage in something called role taking. Now, role taking is learned. It's not innate. It's something we have to learn how to do. And I'm going to walk you guys through the process of how we learn this again over the next couple of videos. But when we engage in role taking, what we do is we assume the position or the perspective of other people, and we look at the world from those positions. We look at the world from those perspectives. Now, put these two things together, right? If we are able to direct thought toward ourselves, if we are able to take some part of ourself and look at ourself, right, from that vantage point, imagine what we could do then if we put ourselves in the position of a social other, like a parent or a teacher or a community, and we look at ourselves from that point of view. It's still internal. It's still me looking at me. It's still a kind of a reflection of my capacity for reflexive behavior, but I'm now using a social resource, the perspective or the point of view of another person, to evaluate myself. Right? So this role taking, this is learned. This is something that develops. It's not something we're born with. It's something that we cannot do in the absence of a capacity for reflexive behavior. But the presence of reflexive behavior by itself is not enough to lead to role taking. You have to learn the role of the other, right? You have to become familiar with the expectations of other people so that you can look at yourself from that point of view. And for Mead, he says this occurs through sort of three developmental stages. And then the first, what he calls the preparatory stage, we are in a period of socialization in which we lack a really developed sense of self, and we can't really differentiate our roles from the roles of others. right? So that's the nature of the preparatory stage, is one in which we don't really understand that we are a separate and distinct social object, that we may be aware that we're in a world that is populated by a wide variety of things, but it's hard for us to know sort of what those things are and what their relationship is to us. Um, what will happen over time and through exposure and a number of social experiences is that we're going to begin to learn that the world is divided up into discrete and distinct and separate social objects, right? That we are one of many things that are connected to one another, but not in a physical sense, but rather an interactional sense. So let me make it really, really concrete. Imagine a baby, right? Um, you're standing in line at Starbucks. Person in front of you has a little baby carrier, and there's a little baby in there, really, really, maybe a few months old. And you want to talk to the baby, right? So you lean over and you do the the baby talk that we sort of use when we talk to babies. Slow, exaggerated, big facial expressions, right? Um, all of that sort of culturally defined behavior that we call baby talk. We do this, I think, most of the time to try to get a reaction. Now, if you ask somebody, why do you talk to a baby, right? Well, we want to stimulate the intellectual development of blah, 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 right? Maybe. But I really think the main reason why we do it is we're trying to get the baby to smile or laugh, because when the child smiles or laughs, you see a very sort of happy and joyous reaction from the person who is trying to get that reaction from the baby. So that's kind of how you know it's all about the reaction. So you engage in this baby talk because you want to make the baby smile, you want to make the baby laugh. From the perspective of the baby, right? They have no idea what's going on. This thing keeps leaning over them, going bleh, 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 bleh. And it will keep doing that until you, right, the baby, smile or cry or react in some way. And when you engage in some kind of behavior, this other thing reacts to your action, and you begin to realize, okay, I have a relationship with these things in the world around me. My behavior has an impact on those things. It's not a conscious sort of learning. It's not like Stewie from Family Guy where you're keeping a journal, like day 3. I think I figured out this damnable woman, right? It's a kind of unconscious learning, but it's really, really important. We're absorbing all of these experiences, and we're not really in a position where we can order them and arrange them into a coherent framework yet. But it's laying the groundwork for that kind of growth and development that will occur subsequently. Over time, for example, you're going to learn that one of the blobs that leans over you a lot and talks to you a lot is mom. And another blob that leans over you and talks to you a lot is dad. And mom and dad are not the same, right? They're different. They interact with you in ways that are different. There might be some similarities, but there are also some key distinctions. And they also interact with each other. You can observe them behaving toward each other in a way that's different than the way that they behave toward you. And then, you move out into a broader social world. Maybe at some point you go over to another house and there's another young child there, and you observe them interacting with their mother, or you observe them interacting with their father, and you realize, oh, mother and father aren't just unique to me, right? They're not something that only exist in my environment. They're these kind of social phenomenon. All of this stuff is happening in the preparatory stage. You're beginning to recognize that the world is comprised, the social world is comprised of people who occupy distinct roles, distinct statuses and roles, and their behavior is a reflection of those social expectations. It isn't unique or idiosyncratic or special only to you and your immediate family. This is a thing that's broader and more social in nature. As you realize that, one of the things that you're able to begin to do is to imitate. You can play at those the roles of specific others, right? So Mead would call this the play stage. And in the play stage, children engage in a kind of imitative behavior in which they assume the roles of these other people. Not in any deep, meaningful sense yet. It's just, like I said, imitation. But a kid playing house, for example, might pick up a pot and they might pick up a spoon and they say, "Oh, I'm cooking," right? Because that's kind of what they observe when they watch, say, for example, a parent prepare a meal. Or they might say things like, "Wait till your father gets home." Right? They're saying these things and they're doing these things because they've seen other people do and say them. And you're really unbounded at this point. You can be anything, right? If you want to be the father, if you want to be the mother, if you want to be the dog, if you want to be the neighbor, if you want to be the tornado, if you want to, whatever, you can play. You can be a wizard, you can be a dragon, you can be a pony. Because you're just kind of playing at roles. You don't understand that there are rules that govern who gets to play various roles, right? At this point, it's just imitation. But over time, you're going to start to realize that a parent prepares a meal not at random, but at specific times under particular conditions. A parent might say, "Wait till your father gets home," or "Wait till your mother gets home," not randomly, but because you've done something, and it's either something that's going to make a parent proud or angry, and your mother, your father is saying, "Wait till this other parent gets home and sees what you've done," right? So you begin to understand that the behaviors and the actions and the articulations that these various people who occupy these statuses, the things that they do and say reflect the things that other people are doing and saying, right? That these behaviors are embedded in a complex network of others, and the actions of those others are going to be the things that precipitate particular statements or behaviors from you. And at that point, you're in what Mead calls the game stage, because you've gone from play, which is kind of unstructured and imitative, to a game. And then the difference between play and game is that a game has rules and play does not. Right? So in baseball, you hit and you throw and you catch. All of those things are also present in play. The difference is that in baseball, those things happen at particular times under particular conditions. In play, they can happen, when you want them to happen. But one of the things that's really nice about being in the game stage, right, is that you've developed, or you are in the process of finalizing the development of something called the generalized other, which is the perspective of a network of others, not a specific other, right? You're not looking at yourself from the point of view of your mother. You're not looking at yourself from the point of view of your partner. You're not looking at yourself from the point of view of your classmate or your teacher or your principal. You're looking at yourself from all of those positions at the same time. And you have a sense of you, right? You have a sense of yourself that is a reflection of how you understand other people see you. And in this way, it's very similar to Cooley's looking glass self, but it's different enough that we're not gonna kind of collapse these things together and say they're the same. These two guys are emphasizing slightly different things. For Mead, right, it's the acquisition of an understanding of the expectations of others. For Cooley, it's a reaction to how people respond to us in real time, right? So the big distinction there is sort of the presence of others versus the presence of an understanding of others. Cooley, it's the presence of others in the environment around us. For Mead, it's the presence of an understanding of others that we carry around in our minds. But it kind of works the same way. These guys are both sort of describing a process of role taking. They're describing a process of reflexive behavior. They're just emphasizing slightly different things here. So we know how to behave in a given situation because we can understand the expectations of all the other people in that interaction. If you're playing sports, if you're playing baseball, for example, and somebody hits a ball to you, let's say you're playing shortstop, and there's a runner at first base, and there's one out, the batter hits a ball, it comes to you, you pick it up, and you throw it to second base. And you throw it to second base because you understand that the runner over there on first is going to advance to second base, because the rule says that you can't have two runners occupying the same base at the same time. So the person who just hit the ball is going to run from home to first. that means the person at first has to run from first to second. And because you know that, you can take the ball and you can throw it to the second base, the person playing second base, because that's where the runner's going to be. And you don't have to know anything about the runner as a person. You just need to know what is the role of the runner at first when a ball has been put in play. And you understand that if you get it right, your teammates and the fans in the stand are going to be very happy. You understand that if you get it right, the opponents are going to be upset, right? They're going to be angry that you got an out and they're going to be disappointed, right? And you understand that if you screw it up, everyone's going to be really mad at you, except for the fans of the opposing team and the opposing team itself. Right, and you can do that because simultaneously and in this kind of large kind of network understanding of who you are in this social environment relative to all these other people in that environment, you can use that perspective, you can use that generalized other to evaluate yourself, right? And again, you're doing it all up here. You are taking the position of the social other, in this case a generalized other, and you're looking at yourself. You're still directing thought back toward yourself. It's still reflexive behavior and role taking. But the role now is not the role of one person, it's the role of a network or a community or a group as a whole. So this set of others, this generalized other, can be really, really broad, right? What would my country think of me is a statement that actually makes sense from this perspective, even though when you think about it for a second, right, there are 300 million people in America. How could you possibly know what they would think of you? But you have a general sense of what constitutes patriotism and loyalty to one's country. And, if you do something that violates that trust, you can reasonably assume that a lot of those people out there whom you've never met and you never will meet will still somehow be disappointed in you. Right? So it can be as broad as an entire nation or an entire world. It can be as narrow as your 4 best friends, right? It could be the 2 people who are most important to you, your reference group. So the generalized other can operate in a number of different scales, but when we get down to the smallest levels, we've got a group of people whose perspectives ultimately kind of serve as a frame of reference for us, what we would call our peers or our reference group. And you can do this. You can say, okay, if I do this behavior, when I was in the dorms as a freshman, doing a ton of drugs, because that's what I did my freshman year in college back in the 80s. I knew if I decided not to go out partying with my friends, how they would feel about me. I also knew how my mother would feel about me if she knew what I did, right? All my friends are going out to get high and I decided to stay in and study. She'd be proud of me. My friends would be disappointed. If I decide to go party, my friends will be super happy and my mom will be disappointed. I can choose to do either of those 2 things, but I'm always making that choice with an awareness of how other people are going to evaluate the behavior that I engage in. And I don't need them there to tell me that because I have a version of them up here. And I refer to that, right? I draw on that generalized other to evaluate myself. So when we talk about a reference group, we're talking about a group that we tend to listen to, a group of people whose perspectives and insights serve as kind of the go-to group that we're trying to more often than not conform our behavior to, the expectations of that group we're trying to conform our behavior to. So I want to say one last thing about this because we're going to contrast this, especially in the chapter, we're going to contrast this developmental view with other social psychological views of development, like from Piaget or Erikson. And when you read about Piaget and you read about Erikson, one of the things you'll notice in the descriptions of their models of development is the importance of particular ages, right? So Piaget and Kohlberg both make reference to particular ages at which a stage of development is occurring. It is really tempting sometimes to think that that was something that Mead was pushing, and something that sociologists doing this kind of social psychology were pushing. And it's not necessarily the case that age is the most important variable. There was a sociologist at the University of Illinois back in the 80s and 90s named Norman Denzin, and Norman Denzin kind of elaborated a little bit on Mead's theories of development, right? So the preparatory stage, play stage, and game stage roughly correspond to, say, the first year of life, and then anywhere from ages 2 to 5, and then, from 5 on upward, you're in that game stage. You're able to sort of fit your behavior into this broader network of others. But Denzin cautions us not to get too attached to age, because it isn't really age. It isn't physical maturation that matters. It's actually the range and sophistication of interactions that we've had. So if you take a human and you raise it in an environment of almost total social isolation, like, for example, Jeannie or Danielle or some of these other examples of what we call feral children, you'll see that selves don't really develop. Even though Jeannie's a very famous case of a girl who was rescued by human services or child services in Los Angeles back in the late 60s. She had been raised in fairly extreme isolation for about 13 years. She had limited contact with her mother and her brother, who would bring her food, but most of the time she was kept either confined to a toilet chair in a room where she couldn't see out and other people couldn't see in, or at night in a bed that had a little cage thing over the top of it. So she never, because she didn't have extended interactions with anybody, and she had incredibly limited interactions with just a couple of people, a mother and a brother specifically. When they finally rescued her from those conditions, they discovered that even though she was 13 years old, she didn't have anything that would resemble what we think of as a self, right? Her self had never developed, because while her body and her brain physically matured, the inputs that were necessary for the development of a generalized other, which would be the statuses and roles of other people in the society around you, she never got exposed to any of those things. She couldn't use those perspectives or those viewpoints to evaluate her own behavior and figure out how to organize her behavior according to those expectations. So in the absence of these social inputs, even though the body physically matures, even though time passes and chronology works the way it works, the self will not just sort of develop organically out of the body. It has to develop as a result of interactions with social others. So this suggests two really, really important things. One, the absolutely critical role played by social inputs in the development of the self. Also, it points to a certain degree of plasticity in the human brain in early childhood that diminishes with age, because once Jeannie was rescued at age 13 and they tried to socialize her to get her sort of up to speed so that she was sort of appropriate for her, her social development was appropriate for her age, it didn't really work. There's a certain point at which the ability for the brain to absorb that kind of information diminishes. It never completely goes away, but the brain becomes less receptive to those kinds of inputs, and there seems to be a period of time after which it becomes almost impossible to replicate the effects of a rich and varied set of social experiences that a child would have in early childhood, and thus a self doesn't really develop. So it's, again, a kind of an interesting example of the way in which selves are ultimately social constructs. So I hope that's clear to everybody. Again, if it's not, there's going to be ample opportunity for you guys to ask questions, and I encourage you, of course, to do that either in class or in the discussion boards. So with that, I'll just say goodbye for now, and I'll see you next time.